Welcome back to sqadia.com. My name is Dr. Mohammad Osama, and today we are talking about cellular reactions to injury. And the first topic that we are going to cover in this series is hypoxic cell injury. It is a very important topic when we talk about the pathology and physiology of cell. So it would constitute of the causes of hypoxic cell injury, the early stage of hypoxic cell injury, as well as the later stage or late stage of hypoxic cell injury, followed by the cell death following the hypoxia. So let's start off with the hypoxic cell injury. That what is hypoxic cell injury? The cause is anoxia or hypoxia. Anoxia is actually the absence of oxygen, and hypoxia is actually the diminished supply of oxygen, because oxygen is very important for different processes like oxidative phosphorylation, which requires oxygen to produce energy and ATP. How does this anoxia or hypoxia occurs? It can happen in response to different conditions or circumstances. The most common are ischemia, in which there is lack of blood supply. Another very important condition is anemia, in which there is normal blood supply, but the problem is that there is lack of erythrocytes, or there is lack of hemoglobin, which means that the oxygen carrying capacity of blood is diminished. So even though there is adequate supply of blood, there is not adequate supply of oxygen, which results in anoxia or hypoxia. Then there is another important condition, which is carbon monoxide poisoning, in which the carbon monoxide actually binds with the hemoglobin and it does not let oxygen to bind with the hemoglobin. What happens is that the carrying capacity of the hemoglobin or blood to carry oxygen is diminished. And even though the blood reaches the area where the oxygen is required, but the hemoglobin is bound with carbon monoxide instead of oxygen, and thus the tissues or the cells do not get the oxygen which they require for different processes, and thus that leads to anoxia or hypoxia. Another thing is decreased tissue perfusion, which can be due to different issues such as occlusion of the capillaries or arteries, which even though that there is proper oxygenation of the blood, but still the blood cannot reach to that area or structure. And then there is the poor oxygenation of blood. This has to do with the pulmonary system, in which there is actually a process of inspiration in which a person breathes and the air goes into the lungs, and then the oxygen binds with the blood, which consists of hemoglobin. But what happens in pulmonary disease is that this oxygenation of blood does not occur properly, or there's diminished oxygenation of blood. So even though if the blood reaches the site where the oxygen is required, and even if there is adequate amount of hemoglobin and erythrocytes, there is still not adequate supply of oxygen, and that again leads to anoxia and hypoxia. So what happens when hypoxia occurs? It results in hypoxic cell injury, and then there are some early manifestations and late manifestations of hypoxic cell injury. So let's start off with the early stage manifestations of hypoxic cell injury. So what happens is that the hypoxia or anoxia or hypoxia actually affects the mitochondria, because in mitochondria there is a process which is known as oxidative phosphorylation which occurs. And in the absence or diminished supply of oxygen, oxidative phosphorylation cannot occur because it requires oxygen. And when the oxidative phosphorylation does not occur or it is impaired, then ATP synthesis cannot occur, because oxidative phosphorylation is the process which actually occurs in the mitochondria, which results in ATP formation, which is actually the energy currency or energy packets that the cell utilizes. In the absence of oxygen, then one of the early manifestations is actually the failure of the cell membrane pump, because it requires ATP to process. What the ATP pump does is that it pumps out sodium outside of the cell and it pumps in potassium into the cell. And when this pump cannot operate because of the absence of adenosine triphosphate or energy, then intracellular increase in the sodium occurs, and then there is a decrease in the potassium level in the cell as well, which results in cellular swelling, and that is actually characterized by large vacuoles in the cell. This then leads to the swelling of the organelles as well. The first organelle that involves in this is the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, which is then followed by reversible changes in the mitochondria and mitochondrial swelling, followed by irreversible changes in the mitochondria and mitochondrial swelling as the condition progresses. Then it is followed by disaggregation of ribosomes, which means that ribosomes is dismantled into different constituent parts, and once it is dismantled, it cannot perform its very important function of protein synthesis. So obviously disaggregation of ribosomes results in protein synthesis failure, because that is the function of ribosomes. Then another thing that is actually the early stage manifestation of hypoxic cell injury is the stimulation of phosphorofructokinase activity, which is actually involved in anaerobic respiration because of the absence of the oxidative phosphorylation, because in the absence of oxygen or hypoxia. So what happens is that increased glycolysis occurs, and as we know that lactate is the end product of glycolysis, that results in the accumulation of the lactate, and as lactate is acidic in nature, so it results in a decreased pH of the cell, and a change in the pH or change in the pH environment then results in the clumping of the nuclear chromatin. So these are a few of the early stage manifestations of the hypoxic cell injury. Now let's talk about the late stage of the hypoxic cell injury. In this stage, the membrane damage to cellular and organelle membrane occurs, like the overall cell membrane or the plasma membrane of the cell. It also gets damaged, as well as the organelle membranes, as it is a eukaryotic cell, they also get damaged with loss of the phospholipids, which is an integral part of the structure of the cell membrane. That is why it is also known as lipid bilayer, because of the presence of phospholipids. Some of the reversible changes which occur in the later stage of the hypoxic cell injury include the myelin figures, which are actually whorl-like structures. If you look at this figure here, now this is a normal cell, and this is a reversible injury mechanism that is occurring because of either hypoxia, anoxia, or apoxia. So you can see here, now this is actually a whorl here, which is actually a myelin fiber, and these are actually derivatives of the you can say destructed or phospholipids which have been carried out in this process. And then there's another very important manifestation which we can find here as well, which is the cell blebs. These are actually the outgrowths which you can see here. Now this is a cell bleb, now this is another cell bleb, this is another cell bleb, and these are actually present, or these actually occur because of the disorder of the cellular cytoskeleton, which actually is responsible for the shape of the cell. So the two important manifestations are actually the membrane damage, myelin figures, and cell blebs. But the good thing is that these are reversible phenomena. So if hypoxia is elevated by the supply of oxygen, ample supply of oxygen, then these changes can be reversible. But sometimes this destruction follows, and there is no rehabilitation, or there is no recovery of the oxygen supply, and the hypoxia or apoxia or anoxia prevails. So what happens is that then this hypoxia results in cell death, because what happens is that after the late stage, when it is leading to the cell death, irreversible damage to the cell membrane occurs. So when the irreversible damage occurs and the cell membrane is damaged, now there is actually a continuity between the inside and the outside environment, and now the cell is not in, this integrity of the cell is not ample, it is not safe. So everything is in continuity with the outside. So what happens is that the different components from the outside can now influx the cell. They can move into the cell. One of them is the calcium. So what happens is that calcium influx occurs, and that results in the accumulation of that calcium in the mitochondria, resulting in the calcification of the mitochondria, which in itself is a very important organelle because it is involved in the oxidative phosphorylation and ATP production and synthesis. So when the calcification of mitochondria occurs, it becomes non-functional, and then no energy, no nutrition, and that results in cell death because there is no energy currency to perform the cell functions, as well as there is no structural integrity because the irreversible damage to cell membrane has occurred. So these type of hypoxic injuries can occur in different tissues, and when the integrity of cell membrane is lost, so all of those enzymes which are actually present in the cells, they come into the intracellular, the extracellular environment. And let's take the example of myocardial enzymes and liver enzymes. So what happened in, for example, in pathology of the heart, or in the pathology of the liver, these enzymes after the cell death, they come outside, and then these enzymes can be used for the diagnosis or for the assessment if there is any myocardial damage or hepatic or liver damage. So let's take the example of myocardial enzymes. So aspartate aminotransferase, also known as AST and formerly known as SGOT as well, and lactate dehydrogenase, very important and commonly used, LDH, and creatine kinase CK and CPK. So elevated levels of these myocardial enzymes would actually show that a hypoxic cell injury resulting in cell death has occurred, and that can give you a diagnostic point of view. Then followed by liver enzymes, similarly transaminases and alanine aminotransferase, alkaline phosphatase, and gamma glutamyl transferase GGT. So these are different enzymes which are used for the diagnosis and assessment of liver damage as well. So they are also because of the different types of cell injuries which are resulting from hypoxia that is occurring. So another important thing in hypoxia is that the vulnerability of different tissues, different cells to hypoxia or the lack of oxygen is different. Like, for example, let's take the example of neurons. They are the most sensitive whenever there is lack of oxygen. They deteriorate, they die very quickly. So they can have only, you can say, a threshold of 3 to 5 minutes. And on the other hand, heart and liver can survive for a little longer, and they have the threshold for 1 to 2 hours as compared to 3 to 5 minutes of neurons. And when we talk about the muscles, they have muscles like skeletal muscles. They have a very good threshold, and they can survive for several hours even with the absence or diminished oxygen supply because of using the anaerobic pathways like the lactate production in which occurs, and that actually also results in muscle soreness as well. So here we can see the progressive injury, the irreversible things that are actually occurring. So you can see that these myelin figures from the late stage of hypoxia are also there, and then there is actually amorphous densities because of the calcification in the mitochondria, and it becomes damaged, and then breakdown of plasma membrane. You can see the integrity of the cell is not anymore present, and breakdown of organelles and nuclei and leakage of the contents outside, and then the deep WBCs come and they engulf the necrotic material. So that was all about hypoxic cell injury. We talked about the cause of hypoxic cell injury, the early and late stages of hypoxic cell injury, and the cell death which results in response to hypoxic cell injury if it is not reversible. In the next topic, we're going to talk about free radical injury, chemical cell injury, and adaptation to environmental stresses. So stay tuned to sqadia.com. See you soon.